I pretty much showed in a prior episode that the story of the flood with Noah's Ark was nothing but a direct plagiarization of the Sumerian text that proceeded about 1,000 years before it. But what about the story of the original creation itself? Were the Hebrews the original owners of this tale? Or once again were they influenced by written stories that preceded them? In an earlier episode, I slam dunk proved that the Hebrew story of Noah and the Ark was plagiarized from earlier Sumerian texts. You'd have to be completely ignorant, which most Christian fundamentalists are, not to understand this, as the two stories are identical. And we have the timeline that the Sumerian story was created first. But what about the initial story of creation in Genesis? Did the Hebrews come up with that on their own? Or are they once again guilty of plagiarizing someone else's work? Well, you know what? It certainly seems that many different cultures were influenced by the same theme with their own version of how the world started. And most of them were written around the same time period, hundreds of years before Christ, except for the oldest text we have, the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh. But all the stories seem to carry the same talking points. The gods created man out of a mixture of the earth's dirt. The gods were somehow angered, usually due to a trickster, and mankind has suffered pain and hardship ever since. And I'll cover the Sumerian story as its own entity because it's the one that seems to point to the plagiarization, or at least borrowing of ideas at the very least, for the Hebrew written story centuries later. But first, let's look at how man was created with other cultural stories. In the Chinese version, the mother goddess is someone named Nuwa, who grew lonely while walking along the banks of a river and began to mold creatures out of clay. And then from this, she decided to create the highest level creature, and mankind was formed. And the mankind she created was formed in her own image. Sound familiar? Now, in the ancient Roman tale, Ovid's Metamorphosis, the gods separated light from dark, like Genesis, earth from sky, created all the animals first, like Genesis. Another god, Prometheus, was credited with making man by mixing the dirt of the earth with fresh rainwater. And he noted that man was to be the master of all things. Does this sound familiar? It should, because this is exactly what Genesis' story of creation says as well. In one Egyptian creation myth, the god Amen commands another god to create human beings like a potter who molds clay on a potter's wheel. So it seems that the molded from the earth, molded from the clay, is common with all of these stories. Now, it's important to note the timeline here. The Roman and Chinese stories of creation were written somewhere between 400 and 800 BC. And this is approximately the time when they think the book of Genesis was written as well. So is it possible that the Romans and Chinese were influenced by the Hebrew story? I'm a fair guy, and I'm going to say this is possible. And there's also commonalities in some of these stories of there being a trickster, just like the serpent in Genesis. Prometheus was the villain in the Roman story. By stealing fire from the gods and delivering it to mankind, this allowed man to develop civilization. In other words, it was a way for mankind to begin to gain knowledge. And after Zeus took care of Prometheus by strapping him to a rock and having an eagle pick at his liver for the rest of eternity, Pandora was sent with her box, which once opened, unleashed all the pain and misery on mankind forevermore. Which, just like Eve, places the initial blame for the misery of mankind on a woman. There was also a trickster involved in the origin of creation in the African version. In the African version, which points to the origin of death in mankind, death was not known to humans until suddenly one man died for no reason, and their gods instructed them to put the dead man at the fork of a tree, in which they would bring him back to life. But a trickster, this time a lizard in lieu of a snake, told the humans to bury the man, thus defying the gods' instructions, in which we have had death ever since. But so far, you can't point the finger of plagiarization at the poor Hebrews, as all these stories seem to be intermingled with each other with the same themes. It's kind of like reading two vampire stories, one from Stephen King and one from Clive Barker, each having a different spin on the same plot. And the myriad of these tales are so close together in time that we don't know who was influenced by whom. Fair enough. But now let's look at the Sumerian texts. we can emphatically date that the oldest literature text we have is from the Sumerians, notably the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's also important to note that the Sumerians existed long before the Hebrews, and lived in the exact same region of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates River. And these stories were first written somewhere between 1600 and 2100 BC, long before any of the other tales of creation were formulated. And this is where the Hebrews' handgun begins to smoke. In the Sumerian version, mankind was created from the mud of the earth and the blood of a slain god. Not identical to Genesis, but very similar. And this is interesting because humankind is caught between the crossfires between the god Enki and Anu. And the question of contention is knowledge and immortality. The god Enki had given man, who is interestingly named Adapa, knowledge of powerful spells, so mankind would be less subject to the lesser divinities. When Anu, who is the lord of the sky, realizes that man has this liberating knowledge, he summons him to heaven and decides to grant him immortality by having him eat the bread of life. The bread that Enki, the other god of the earth who Adapa serves, told him not to consume, for he would surely die. Does that sound a little too close to home to the forbidden fruit, which was described in Genesis? That's because it is. They're not identical like the story of Noah's Ark and the Epic of King Altrahesis, but they are highly similar, aren't they? With two different cultures, the Hebrews coming into existence as the Sumerians were fading away, living in the same area between the Tigris and Euphrates River, and I'm supposed to believe that the Hebrews didn't at least borrow the theme of this story. But there's a couple other interesting notables in the similarity of the tales. There is also a paradise called Eridu. This sounds very much like the Garden of Eden, except Eridu was a place where only the immortals were supposed to reside, and as we know, Adam and Eve originally resided in Eden before they were cast out. But it's interesting to note how this paradise exists in both the Sumerian and Hebrew texts. Now, when the smoking gun fires into the accusation that Hebrews took parts of the Sumerian text to formulate their own story of the creation of mankind, it does when you look at the excerpt of the Lady of the Rib in the earlier Sumerian texts. Because in this version, the god Enki was punished by another god for his infidelity by a cast of great pain on his rib, in which finally the rib was removed, which resulted in the creation of the goddess Nintai. So God taking a rib from Adam in order to create Eve is not an original plot. Now, as I said, this is not a slam dunk like the Noah's Ark story was when compared with the Epic of King Altrahesis, showing that the Sumerian version of the flood story and the Hebrew version of the flood story were completely identical, minus the changing of characters in the tale. But there are some pretty obvious similarities to the Sumerian creation story and the Hebrew one. Now, it's very possible that the other cultures' creation stories also took bits and pieces from the original Sumerian one. But the point is, so did the Hebrews, obviously. They didn't come up with a Garden of Eden paradise. They didn't come up with taking a male rib to form a woman. The idea of humans in a pursuit of knowledge wasn't theirs. And there's also the very inconvenient fact that we know the Hebrews plagiarized before. The story of Genesis includes the story of Noah's Ark. The story of Noah's Ark is almost a direct copy from Sumerian texts. So obviously the ancient Hebrews were very influenced by the Sumerian tales. The Christian fundamentalist would have to be an absolute cult member to think that the origination of the creation story solely belongs to the Hebrews. But then again, as we've shown before, the Christian fundamentalist is a cult member, which is why they can't see that the story of Noah's Ark, as well as the foundation for the creation of the world and mankind, isn't their own, but dates back to a culture that lived far before them. But if you're interested in a modern tale, which I at least admit is fiction, check out my novel, The Second Fall, an offbeat apocalypse of what I think Christ would be like if he ever ventured back to Earth. Highly irreverent and sure to offend the fundamentalist. On Amazon now, link is in the video description as well as the banner, and I will see you next time as we take reason and reality and thrust it into the heart of ignorance.